What's the best way to prepare a chapter outline for your book? Hi there, my name is Brian Collins and welcome to the Become a Writer Today channel. So I've written and self-published a couple of books over the years, including my most recent book, I Can't Believe I'm a Dad. And I've experimented with different forms of creating chapter outlines. In this video, I'm going to walk through how you can create your chapter outline quickly and easily and explain why you should do it. I'm also going to make some recommendations for tools, both digital and analog, which will help you with your first chapter outline if you're new to the process. Hope you enjoy the content in this video, all about creating chapter outlines. If you do, hit thumbs up, and if you want to get more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. First up, it's helpful to understand why you should create a chapter outline in the first place. The number one reason for creating a chapter outline is if you have a fear of this. I'm talking about the flashing blank cursor. Now, while many fiction writers like to turn up and write from the seat of their pants about whatever is on their mind for their story or their creative writing piece, that can be a lot more difficult for other types of writers who are plotters, and also for non-fiction writers and for writers like me. Personally, I hate turning up and seeing a flashing cursor, because how can I know what my article, or in this case my chapter, is going to be about if I don't have an idea of the key parts of the chapter and the key idea for the chapter in question? So the number one reason why you want to create a chapter outline is to write your chapter faster. The second reason is to save time self-editing. And I'm going to show you in a moment why creating a chapter outline will help you save time self-editing. And the third reason is to avoid writer's block. The fourth reason is to figure out where your chapter fits in with the rest of your book, because when you have an outline, you can arrange all of the elements within a chapter and also see where the chapter fits in relation to other chapters in the book. The final reason for creating a chapter outline is it clarifies your thinking. In other words, you're not going to think through your ideas on the page. You're already going to do that before you turn up and write your first draft. Now, with that said, let's go over to some of the different tools that I recommend for creating chapter outlines. The first tool that you can use to create a chapter outline is an analog tool. In other words, you don't need any fancy software. I recommend picking up a set of these. It's a packet of index cards, and you can use one index card per chapter in your book, and then you can lay them out on a table or on the floor, and then you can visualize all of the structure of your book and also visualize what's inside of each chapter, and then you can move them around. So this is a good approach if you don't like using software, or if you find it a little bit distracting or limiting. The second type of tool that you can use is something that I have here to my left. So it's a large whiteboard, and you can write a chapter outline on a whiteboard, and then because it's a whiteboard, you can quickly erase your mistakes and move around key elements inside of your chapter outline. Now, I've experimented with both of those approaches over the years, and they've worked quite well for me. But lately, I've been using two software tools for creating chapter outlines for my books. Chances are you're already familiar with one of them because it's popular in the writing community. It's called Scrivener, and Scrivener is an app that I've used to write a thesis, to write a collection of short stories years ago when I used to write fiction, and also to write several non-fiction books. And I actually created my chapter outlines directly in Scrivener, and I'll show you how I did that in a moment. The app I use the most for creating outlines is called Workflowy. It's a purpose-built app for creating outlines. It's not purposely aimed at writers, but writers can use it for chapters and for their stories. And I've reviewed Workflowy extensively on the Become a Writer Today channel, so do check out that video. There's another alternative called Dynalist, which you can use. It's also relatively affordable. But that said, you can use the principles that I'm about to show you for creating your chapter outline in Scrivener, in Google Docs, or with index cards or a whiteboard. Now, here's a couple of prerequisites that you want to bear in mind before you create your first chapter outline. So first up, decide what the chapter is about. I always find it's helpful to sum up the chapter in a few key sentences in advance, or in a few key bullet points. They don't need to be grammatically correct, and it may not necessarily be an idea or a sentence that makes its way into the final draft, but figuring out what the chapter isn't about in advance will help you get over the fear of the flashing cursor and also start writing it much more easily. Deciding what the chapter is about is also known as coming up with the controlling idea, or a statement, or a summary. And doing all of this will help you with your chapter outline. Next up, once you've understand what the chapter is about, I recommend picking 5 to 7 points that you want to hit in your chapter if it's non-fiction. So to do this, you're going to check your notes and research and think of the key ideas that you want to draw upon for your chapter outline. And if you're writing fiction, you're also going to think of the story ideas or the plot moments that you want to draw upon for this particular chapter in question. So perhaps this chapter is an inciting incident if you're writing a thriller book, whereby something happens that calls our hero or protagonist to life. Well, in that case, what are the key things that need to happen for this inciting incident, and how can you illustrate these with your stories? That actually brings me to the next point. Now, I write a lot of non-fiction, so you'll probably notice that my advice is a little bit geared more towards non-fiction writers. But again, you can use these principles for your fiction outline. So if you're writing non-fiction, it's always helpful to illustrate the key points in your non-fiction book chapter with a story, because that way it'll be more memorable, more colourful, and more enjoyable for the reader. So ask yourself, what stories can you draw upon from your personal life, or from your research, or from your interviews, or from your creative approach, and how can you put these into your non-fiction chapter? Doing this upfront will help you figure out the structure of your chapter and also put a bit of colour and personality into it. So it won't be just boring information, it'll actually be something that readers will enjoy. I also recommend that you decide on the chapter word count in advance. Now, for this book, the book that I had on screen a few moments ago, I Can't Believe I'm a Dad, this is about 65,000 words long. I set a target word count of 60,000 words when I was writing the book. I broke that down into 1,500 to 2,000 words per chapter, and I broke each section down into 300 to 500 words per section, and I set myself a task of writing one of these per day, because I found I could get through 300 to 500 words in a 25-minute writing session. Sometimes I would have several writing sessions in a row, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So once you've done this, it's a lot easier to write 300 to 500 words, or write just 25 minutes. Than it is to say to yourself that I'm going to write a 60,000 plus word book. And this is also helpful because it can help you plan when you're going to write your chapters, the parts of your chapters, when you're going to finish your chapters and send them to your editor. And it can also help you figure out what the structure of your book looks like. So for example, what's going to go into Act 1 of your book, Act 2 and Act 3. That actually brings me to the next point. Where does your chapter fit in with the rest of the book? So if it's Act 1, typically Act 1 will form 20 to 30% of the book. Act 2 is the meat of the book and will form up to 60%. And then Act 3 will form the remainder. So if you figure out where this chapter fits in with the rest of the book, that will help you determine if you need to foreshadow events if you're writing fiction, or we need to call back to earlier events or earlier ideas that you've elaborated on in Act 1. And it can help you figure out what points you need to explain in detail in the chapter versus what points you can already gloss over because you've already illustrated these with your ideas, arguments, and stories. And when you're doing all of this, don't forget to move around. So if you were to think of what I have on screen here as a chapter about how to write chapter outlines, I can move these bullet points up and down and figure out what's the best place to put them in the structure of this particular outline. And you should do the same with your chapter outlines. So you could essentially just free write. You could free write 20 to 30 bullets that you want to cover in your chapter. And then you can just move these bullets around until you feel like it has some sort of organic structure. And then what you can do is you can write your chapter in one go. Now, there's a couple of approaches that I recommend for this. So if you have an outline that you're relatively happy with, I'd encourage you to consider just dictating the first draft. Now, you can dictate with your iPhone or with your Android device using an app like from Dragon. They have some excellent dictation software, which I've reviewed on Become a Writer today. And I love dictation because, well, it's faster than writing or faster than typing. It also encourages you to just simply get ideas out of your head without stopping to edit yourself. And that's the job of any first draft, to simply exist. And dictation also is something that you can do when you're not confined to your desk or your computer. So you could dictate your first draft while you're out for a walk. And I actually did this with some chapters for this book. So what I did is I had the bullet point outline on some index cards, and I took my phone and a set of AirPods and went for a walk in a quiet, near a quiet canal. And I dictated some of the chapters into my iPhone, and every now and again I'd refer to the bullet points on the index card to see if there's anything I missed, and this would helped me write the first draft for this chapter a lot faster. Another approach that you can use is just free write. So if you think back to the flashing cursor that I had on screen a few moments ago, if you have your outline, you can just open up your word processor, have your outline on the right hand side or the left hand side, and then have your writing app in the center of your screen, and then just simply write and try and hit all of the key ideas without worrying about grammar or typos or other mistakes that you're going to make. Now, I talked a few moments ago about your writing session for your chapter. So typically 25 minutes is enough to produce 300 to 500 words. And anybody can fit 25 minutes into the writing day. So you could probably get a good section or a good chunk of your chapter done in 25 minutes if you set a timer and write without distraction until you hit your target word count. And of course, if you have a bit more time or you're feeling a bit more creative, you can do 3 or 4 of these writing sessions in a row before you move on to something else. And once you've done all that, what I encourage you to do is let your first draft sit. So a good rule for writers is to write in the morning and edit in the afternoon, because these tasks engage different parts of the brain. So I'd encourage you to write or outline in the morning when you're feeling creative, and then maybe to let it sit for a couple of hours or even a couple of days, depending on the length of the chapter and the project in question, and then go back and edit it with a more critical mind and fix those mistakes. While you're editing your chapter, I also have some other tips that might help. Don't forget to print your work out, because that can help you spot issues that you can miss when you're looking at something on the screen. I'd encourage you to read it aloud as well. Sometimes reading a chapter aloud will help you get a feel for what the chapter and the writing actually sounds like. And then when you're reading through your manuscript, have a red pen and print it out with double space and in a Courier font, so that way you can easily see what the letters look like, but you'll also have space to write in between the sentences about changes that you want to make. So putting these tips into practice will help you create your chapter outline and then write it. Now I want to show you an example of what a chapter outline looked like for one of my books. So I have on screen the early draft of I Can't Believe I'm a Dad. I use the writing app Scrivener to write my chapters. This particular chapter is 2,580 words long. I reduced it a little bit during the editing process, but it's a good example of what a chapter looked like in the book. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how the chapters were structured for this particular book. I started each chapter with a haiku that I wrote because this was kind of a creative project. Then I summarized on advice from my editor the key idea inside of each chapter, because it was non-fiction, and this is probably something that a lot of non-fiction writers do. Then I started each one of the stories or each one of the chapters with a personal story that illustrated the points that I was going to talk about. In this case, I talked about my experiences as a kid when my parents were disciplining me and how I changed my approach to discipline as a dad to 3 kids. Then I had a pivot in each one of the chapters where we'd actually get into some, I suppose, advice for new dads, which was a key idea of the book. So I talked about some experiences that I had when I got things wrong. And then I started turning that then into kind of more prescriptive advice or my thoughts on how new dads can parent their children. And then finally, I summarized each of the key ideas in the chapter with a takeaway section. And then I also had some practical tips at the end. Now, it took me a while to come up with this particular structure, but it worked quite well for the book, and it was something that my editor helped me refine. So I'd encourage you in advance to come up with an idea for the structure of your chapters, because this will help with the outlining process. Now, with that said, let's go back over to Workflowy so I can show you the outline for this particular chapter. So I have up here the chapter title. At one point this was called the rules, but I put all the chapter outlines into a master document and then renamed them. I have the controlling idea for this particular chapter about how kids respond well to structure and rules. I have the word count. Obviously I went a bit over that. In the introduction, I refer to a personal story to illustrate my point. This doesn't make sense, I guess, to anybody who's reading the outline, but it was kind of a writing prompt for me of a personal story that illustrates parental discipline I was able to draw upon. Then I just simply free wrote or brainstormed using bullet points about some rules that I wanted to come up with that I might have taken on board subconsciously. And again, why I like outlining apps is, I can move these around and I can also indent them, and I can put more things underneath each one. So this helps me do an outline faster than playing around with sentences. Then I come up with a section about timeout. And again, I just brainstormed some key ideas about putting kids into timeout, or if it's a good idea these days. And then a time when one of our kids went into timeout and how I got it wrong. Then I came up with a section in the chapter that I wanted to hit, which was all about how a partner has rules for parenting kids and how you got to find a middle ground. And then how a family has rules. And then at the end, then you can see here I have some bullet points that were quite a bit longer. So basically here again, I just kind of free wrote using bullet points about parenting rules that could potentially be useful and for people with kids and people without kids. And again, not all of this made it into the final draft. This just simply served as kind of prompts for me to write the first draft, which was over 3,000 words. And then I took out the bits that didn't make much sense. Then I had a section called laissez-faire parenting, which almost made it into the book verbatim, and then had the tips that I wanted to hit in the chapter. So if we go back over to the chapter in question, you can see here's the tips. This is the takeaway section where I summarize the key ideas in the chapter. The laissez-faire parenting section, this hubhead made it in verbatim. Then I had a story to illustrate my point. Then if I go further back up, I have another story to illustrate the timeout angle that I talked about there a few moments ago. And then if I go back up further, I have a time when I got parental discipline wrong. And then if I go back up towards the start of the chapter, you can see I have the controlling idea and the personal story. So the key takeaway to understand is that an outline isn't meant to be set in stone. You don't have to include everything that's in your outline. It's simply there to help you write your first draft that bit quicker. And of course, you can do all this with index cards. I'm simply showing you a bullet point outline that I created because it speeds up time for me, because I can indent things and move ideas around rather than playing around with sentences. But you can also just do this in Google Docs by using, or Word, by using just jotting down a few notes in a single document. But I also like Scrivener because Scrivener has an option to select a couple of different chapters, and then you can view them as index cards, and then you can just sum up the key idea for each chapter on an index card, and then you can move these index cards around as well. And it also has a document section where I can again see the title of the chapter, the synopsis or controlling idea, and the status and the word count. So this works quite well too. And again, another option could be you could just simply create a section called outlines in your Scrivener file, and then you can just do it the old-fashioned way. So takeaways, personal story, tips, and you could just have a few keynotes in a blank document in Scrivener or Word or Google Docs, and that could be enough for you to write your chapter in question. And then because it's Scrivener, you could have this open on the right hand side, and then you can have your chapter open on the left hand side. And that's another good way to write your chapter with an outline more quickly and easily. So that's an overview of how I create chapter outlines. In summary, determine what your chapter is about in advance. Pick a word count. Ask yourself, where does the chapter fit in the structure of your book? Come up with 5 to 7 key ideas that you want to hit in your chapter based on that word count. Break those down into small writing sections that you can tick off one by one. And if you're writing non-fiction, you put in a story to illustrate your point. If you're writing fiction, if it's something like the inciting incidents, then look at what that chapter needs to accomplish to drive the plot forward or to help with the beats of your story. And then finally, write your chapter using your outline as quickly as possible without stopping to edit yourself, because writing and editing are 2 different things. Hope you enjoyed the content in this video, all about creating chapter outlines. If you did, hit thumbs up. And if you want to get more videos like this, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel.